The morning had been full of promise, the kind of crisp autumn air that felt clean and bracing in your lungs, like it could rinse you of whatever worries you'd been carrying all week. I had woken up with that lightness in my chest, the kind that comes when the world feels navigable, even just for a few hours. The trail had been carefully chosen, a popular route, moderate in difficulty, looping back neatly to the visitor center. I hadn't expected anything out of the ordinary. I certainly hadn't expected her. She was a last-minute addition, someone who knew someone in our group, and all I remembered at first was the brightness of her eyes and the striking way she moved, like someone who trusted her body completely. She didn't talk much at the start, but there was something in the way she observed everything, how she checked her compass even when others didn't, how she adjusted the straps on her pack with quiet efficiency. I noticed her before I even admitted it to myself. We lost the trail after the third marker. At first, no one thought it was serious. People made jokes about our sense of direction, how we were just exploring alternate routes. The banter didn't last long. The fog rolled in slowly, seeping into the spaces between branches, thickening until trees disappeared only a few meters ahead. It was like someone had taken a watercolor brush to the forest and blurred out all the edges. My phone lost reception, the GPS froze, and then the battery dropped from 30% to dead in less than a minute. Her phone wasn't faring any better. When we looked around, the others were already far ahead or behind. We weren't sure anymore. The sounds of footsteps, laughter, voices, gone, swallowed. It was her idea to keep walking north. She had a better sense of direction than I did. At first, I hesitated, but the cold was creeping in, and standing still wasn't an option. I remember how quiet it got. Not peaceful, not serene, quiet like a held breath. Every snap of a twig under our boots echoed too loudly. Every gust of wind felt like it was whispering something you didn't want to understand. The forest no longer felt like a playground. It felt ancient, watchful, indifferent to our presence. We walked for over an hour, maybe 2. I stopped checking the time. My thoughts started looping. How long until dark? How long until we had to admit we were truly lost? How long until someone realized we hadn't made it back? I kept glancing at her, searching her face for signs of panic, but she never showed any. Just that same steady focus, that tension in her shoulders, like she was carrying more than her pack. I envied her calm, even as my own breathing grew tighter. When we finally saw the roof, it was like a hallucination. Just a jagged triangle of dark wood through the fog, half covered in moss. We both stopped, not trusting it at first, as if it might vanish if we blinked too fast. But it stayed. We climbed a narrow path, the soil loose and damp beneath our feet. The cabin was old, weathered. The door had no lock, only a latch hanging crooked from one rusted hinge. We stepped inside like trespassers, but the air inside was dry, still holding the heat of long-gone days. The floor creaked beneath our boots, the scent of old wood and dust swirling in the silence. There was one narrow window, streaked with dirt and too small to offer a real view. A stove sat in the corner, cold and empty but functional. A single bed, bare mattress, one pillow, wool blanket folded at the foot. The room wasn't cozy. It wasn't even particularly clean, but it was shelter, and it felt like a miracle. We didn't speak for a long time. We each found a corner of the room to occupy, as if distance might protect us from the intimacy of the situation. I took off my pack, my jacket, sat down on the floor, and leaned against the wall, listening to the faint sound of wind outside. She paced for a while, arms crossed, then finally settled across from me, mirroring my position. I could hear her breathing, slow and measured. My own breath felt shakier. I realized how vulnerable we were. No food except a crushed granola bar, half a bottle of water between us. no working phone, no map, no idea where exactly we were. But the fear didn't root itself in my gut like I expected. Instead, there was a strange calm, a kind of surrender. The world had narrowed to 4 wooden walls, 2 backpacks, and the sound of her shifting slightly every time the wind knocked against the cabin. I watched her hands for a long time, the way her fingers moved, rubbing warmth into her palms, tracing the rim of her boot. She didn't know I was watching, or maybe she did and didn't mind. There was something meditative about the motion, something quieting. She eventually stood and started exploring the corners of the room, opening an old drawer, testing the stove door. She found a box of matches half full and held it up like she'd just discovered treasure. We built a fire together, using kindling from a box near the door, dried twigs she'd collected from outside. It took a few tries, but when the flame caught, the room transformed. The walls glowed with orange light, shadows dancing. I felt my shoulders drop, tension I hadn't realized I was holding melt slightly. We sat closer then, letting the heat of the fire stretch across our bodies. She took off her boots. I followed. It felt like the beginning of some ritual, though neither of us named it. Outside, the fog thickened. We couldn't see the trees anymore, only gray, endless, and quiet. The world beyond that window had disappeared entirely, and in its place was only this space, this moment. I started to feel the cold leave my fingertips, the stiffness retreat from my spine. She looked at me then for a long time, not with worry or expectation, just curiosity. I met her gaze without flinching. There was something grounding in it, something that made me feel visible in a way I hadn't in years. I felt stripped down, not in a vulnerable way, but in a clean one, like the fog had wiped away everything superficial and left only what was real. I didn't know then how long we'd be stuck there. I didn't know what the night would bring. But in that suspended moment, surrounded by the scent of smoke and pine, the soft crackle of fire, and the weight of her presence filling every corner of the cabin, I felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not panic, something quieter, deeper, and far more dangerous. I was lost, but not just in the woods. I was lost in her, and part of me didn't want to be found. The fire had burned down to a steady orange core, radiating a soft warmth that reached just far enough to keep the cold at bay. Outside, the fog had thickened into something almost impenetrable, pressing against the windows like a living thing, turning the world beyond the cabin into a shapeless void. Inside, time had slowed to something liquid and heavy, the kind of stillness that makes your thoughts louder and your senses sharper. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind felt amplified, but beneath it all was the low, steady rhythm of our breath, the occasional shift of cloth against cloth, the crackle of a log breaking down into embers. We had stopped pretending there was anything left to do, no trail to follow, no plan to execute, no reason to move unless absolutely necessary. We'd eaten what little we had, shared water in slow, thoughtful sips, and now we simply existed in the same space, separated by inches that felt both intimate and infinite. She had moved closer to the fire, sitting with her legs drawn up beneath her, her chin resting on her knees. Her eyes shimmered in the flickering light, and for a long time, I watched her without speaking, letting my gaze rest on the slope of her neck, the delicate curve of her jaw, the stray curl of hair clinging to her cheek. She pulled her hoodie off slowly, revealing the thin tank top beneath, the fabric clinging to the contours of her body. I felt a sudden heat rise in my chest that had nothing to do with the fire. Her skin looked warm, impossibly soft, like it had absorbed the light of the flames and was now giving it back in subtle glints across her shoulders and collarbones. I looked away for a moment, pretending to adjust the blanket wrapped around my legs, but my heart was thudding too loudly for the illusion to feel real, even to myself. She lay back on the wooden floor, arms stretched out, the curve of her body forming a quiet arc in the firelight. Her eyes closed, but her breathing remained steady, conscious. I stared at the ceiling for a while, tracing invisible patterns in the planks above, but my awareness kept returning to her, to the way her body shifted slightly with each inhale, to the way the firelight painted her silhouette in shadow and glow, to the space between us that had grown tighter since we entered this place. I found myself inching closer, not intentionally, not with any expectation, but as if drawn by something that pulsed beneath the surface of my skin. When I lay beside her, she didn't move, she didn't open her eyes, but the air between our bodies changed. I could feel the warmth radiating from her, the low current of heat and proximity that made every inch of my skin suddenly alert. Her arm was only a few inches from mine, her fingers curled loosely near her side. I watched her chest rise and fall, the way the fabric of her shirt shifted slightly with each breath, and I realized I was holding my own breath without noticing. When I exhaled, it came out slower than I expected, as though my lungs were trying to make sense of the space I now occupied. I turned onto my side, facing her. My shoulder almost brushed hers. I was close enough now to see the faint freckle on the side of her neck, the subtle twitch of her lashes. The line between innocence and something else had grown thinner than the fabric between us. I could feel my own heartbeat in my throat, in my fingertips, in the small of my back. There was a strange stillness in my body, like the calm before a storm you can feel but can't see. My hand twitched once, then stilled. I didn't reach for her. Not yet. Instead, I let the moment wrap itself around me, let the scent of wood smoke and skin settle into my lungs. The fire cracked again, a soft burst of light flickering across her face, and in that instant, her eyes opened. She looked at me with an expression that was neither surprised nor unreadable. It was something else entirely, something soft and unguarded, like a window opened without realizing it. We didn't speak. There was no need. Whatever had been unspoken until now filled the silence between us like fog had filled the trees. I could feel her looking at me, not just with her eyes, but with her whole presence. And I let myself look back, not casually, not pretending. I let my gaze linger on her lips, on the hollow of her throat, on the curve of her shoulder where the strap of her tank top had slipped slightly. I felt my body respond before my mind could catch up. An ache low in my belly, a tightness in my chest, a tingling at the base of my spine. I shifted slightly, and that movement brought my arm against hers, skin to skin. It was the most innocent contact imaginable, but it struck through me like lightning. Her skin was warm, impossibly smooth, and for a second, neither of us moved. Then her fingers brushed against mine, not holding, not grasping, just a whisper of touch, and I thought I might forget how to breathe. The entire world had collapsed into that point of contact, into the electric hum beneath my skin, into the way my nerves lit up in response. I turned my palm upward, slowly, offering without words. Her hands slid into mine, her fingers lacing gently through mine, and it felt like something ancient and inevitable. I could feel the ridges of her knuckles, the softness of her skin, the quiet pressure of her thumb brushing against the side of my hand. My eyes fluttered closed for a second, overwhelmed by the intensity of something so simple. When I opened them again, she had shifted closer. Our bodies were almost touching now, hips aligned, shoulders grazing. Her breath was warm against my cheek, and I could smell her. Not perfume, not soap, just her, clean and human and immediate. I wanted to reach for her. I wanted to press my lips to her collarbone, to taste the hollow of her throat, to memorize the shape of her in the firelight. But I didn't move, not yet, because this moment, this slow, unfolding realization, was more intimate than anything I'd ever known. Her fingers tightened slightly in mine. That was all, but it was enough. I closed my eyes again, let the sensation settle, let the thrum of anticipation build without direction. I could feel her presence in every inch of my body now, like gravity had shifted and she was the only point of balance. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if we would cross the line that night or the next or ever, but I knew with absolute certainty that something had changed. The barrier that had once felt solid had softened, and in its place was only skin and breath and heat. I didn't sleep. Neither did she. We stayed like that, side by side, fingers entwined, not speaking, not touching beyond that one simple gesture. But my skin burned where hers had touched it. My mind spun with images, sensations, possibilities. The fog might have trapped us outside, but inside this cabin, something else had taken root. Something just as thick, just as blinding, just as consuming. And I wasn't afraid of it. I welcomed it. I let it wrap around me like smoke, like skin, like something I hadn't known I was longing for until it was right beside me, breathing in the same rhythm, wrapped in the same quiet firelight. The fire had died down sometime after midnight, but its warmth lingered like a memory in the air, caught between the thick wooden walls and the heavy fabric of the blanket we shared. I had closed my eyes hours ago, maybe out of instinct, maybe to keep from staring at her too openly. Sleep, however, never truly came. I drifted on the edge of it, my body too aware of the closeness beside me, too alert to fully surrender. Her breathing had changed sometime after we lay down together, shallower, quieter, almost measured, and I knew she was awake too. There was a rhythm to the silence, one only we seemed to notice. Every inhale, every shift of weight on the mattress, every brush of fabric sounded like it had meaning, like it was part of a language neither of us had spoken yet. Her hand was still in mine, fingers threaded loosely, like we had fallen asleep as children might, but nothing about it felt childish. The warmth of her skin had seeped into my own, and now my hand felt empty without hers. I could feel the tension in my body, the ache that had built slowly, day by day, moment by moment, now coiled low in my belly like heat waiting for a spark. I didn't know when it had become this intense, only that it was no longer possible to ignore. She shifted beside me, just enough that our hips touched. The contact was soft, barely more than pressure through layers of clothing, but it ignited something in me that had been smoldering for too long. My breath caught in my throat. I kept my eyes closed, afraid that looking at her would shatter the fragile spell that had formed between us. But then her thumb moved, brushing gently over the back of my hand, and everything inside me stilled. It was the lightest touch imaginable, but it made my skin throb with awareness. I opened my eyes slowly and found her already looking at me. She didn't speak, neither did I. There was nothing to say that wouldn't collapse under the weight of the moment. Her eyes held mine, steady and open, and I felt something melt inside me, something long frozen and aching. I turned toward her slowly, our bodies aligning, and I felt the brush of her knee against mine, the soft sweep of her breath against my cheek. My hand slipped from hers and found her waist, fingers resting lightly on the curve of her hip. Her skin was warm through the fabric, and when she didn't pull away, I let my hand explore gently upward, over her rib cage, feeling the flutter of breath beneath. Her lips found mine without hesitation, soft at first, cautious, as though testing the reality of it. But then the kiss deepened, and something broke open between us. Her hand slid into my hair, her body pressing closer, and I felt myself open to her instinctively, hungrily. The heat that had been building inside me surged forward with a force that left me dizzy. Our mouths moved together like they'd always known how to find each other. I tasted her breath, her warmth, something sweet and familiar and utterly intoxicating. She rolled halfway on top of me, her thigh slipping between mine, and I gasped against her mouth, the sudden pressure making my body jolt with sensation. I clung to her, pulling her closer, feeling the weight of her settle over me like a blanket of flame. Her hands roamed freely now, slipping under the hem of my shirt, her fingertips skimming the skin of my stomach, my sides, up to the soft curve of my breasts. I arched into her touch without thinking, my nipples tightening under her palms as she cupped me through the fabric. I felt her mouth leave mine and travel downward, her lips tracing a path along my jaw, my neck, my collarbone, each kiss a spark that lit up my nerves. She lifted my shirt slowly, deliberately, and I raised my arms to let her. The chill of the cabin air against my bare skin was nothing compared to the fire of her hands. She looked at me for a moment, just looked, her eyes roaming over the curves and shadows she had just unveiled. I could see something reverent in her gaze, something raw and unfiltered, and it made me ache all over again. Then she leaned down and took one of my breasts into her mouth, her tongue flicking gently over the nipple, and I cried out softly, my back arching off the mattress in response. Her hand slid down my stomach, pausing at the waistband of my pants. She hesitated, just for a second, and in that pause, I lifted my hips slightly, giving permission, maybe even begging without words. She slipped her hand inside, fingers sliding over the damp heat between my legs, and I thought I might come undone right then. Her touch was slow, exploratory, tender, but purposeful. She circled gently, building tension with an unbearable patience that left me trembling. I buried my face in her shoulder, moaning softly against her skin, unable to hold back the flood of sensation. When she finally slipped a finger inside me, I gasped. My body clenched around her, desperate for more, and she gave it to me. Another finger, deeper pressure, her thumb stroking rhythmically until I was grinding against her hand, chasing release with an intensity I hadn't known I was capable of. The climax came fast and sharp, tearing through me like lightning. I cried out again, this time louder, my body curling around hers as wave after wave crashed over me. She didn't stop right away. She held me, her fingers still moving gently inside me, easing me down from the high with care. I shook beneath her, breath ragged, skin damp with sweat and heat. When she withdrew her hand, she kissed me again. Soft, slow, grounding. I reached for her then, pulling her closer, needing her to feel what I felt, needing to give her what she had just given me. I slid my hands beneath her shirt, lifting it over her head and tossing it aside. Her skin was smooth, her body lithe and strong beneath my touch. I explored her with my mouth, her breasts, her stomach, the sharp angle of her hips. She gasped when I touched her, moaned when I moved lower. I peeled her clothes away with trembling hands, revealing her slowly, reverently, until she was fully bare before me, glowing in the firelight like something sacred. When I kissed her thighs, she opened for me without hesitation, and I settled between them, my tongue finding her warmth, her wetness, her need. She cried out, her hands gripping my shoulders, her hips lifting to meet my mouth. I licked and sucked and tasted her, letting the rhythm rise and fall with the sound of her breath, the tremble in her thighs, the whispered noises that spilled from her lips. She came suddenly, her body stiffening, then melting, her legs tightening around me as she gasped my name again and again. We collapsed together, tangled and exhausted, our skin slick, our hearts still racing. I pulled the blanket over us and held her close, her head resting on my chest, her breath warm against my collarbone. The air in the cabin was still, heavy with smoke and sweat, and something deeper, something that had no name, but was unmistakably real. I closed my eyes, feeling her body pressed against mine, the rhythm of her breath slowly calming, and I knew we had crossed into something new. The heat between us had not just consumed our bodies, it had scorched away everything that came before it, and I didn't want it to stop. I wanted to burn with her again and again. I woke to a silence so complete it felt unnatural, like the world had stopped turning sometime in the night and forgot to start again. The fire had long since died, leaving the air cold and still, and for a moment I didn't move. I lay there on my side, the blanket tangled around my legs, her body still pressed against mine, her arm draped across my stomach, her breath slow and warm against the curve of my neck. My eyes adjusted slowly to the dim morning light leaking through the single window. What I saw made my heart stutter in my chest. The world outside had vanished beneath a heavy blanket of white. Snow covered everything, thick, untouched, and impossibly quiet. It clung to the trees, the porch railing, even the outer edges of the cabin window, muffling all sound, wrapping the forest in a kind of frozen isolation that felt both beautiful and surreal. I stared for a long time, not because I was surprised by it. We knew a storm was possible, but because of how it changed everything. The way it made the cabin feel like an island cut off from the rest of the world. The way it made what happened between us feel like it existed outside of time. She stirred behind me, shifting slightly, her arm tightening for a moment as if to make sure I hadn't slipped away in the night. I could feel the curve of her body against my back, the soft press of her legs entwined with mine, the warmth of her skin in sharp contrast to the cold air creeping in from the walls. I closed my eyes and breathed in slowly. Her scent still clung to me, faint smoke, something sweet from her skin, the unmistakable trace of what we had done still lingering between my thighs and in the ache low in my belly. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. There was a strange serenity in the air, an unspoken agreement to stay wrapped in this quiet just a little longer. I turned slowly in her arms, facing her. Her eyes were already open, watching me with that same unreadable softness that had burned into my memory the night before. Her hair was a mess, strands sticking out at odd angles, and there were faint lines on her cheek from the pillow. But she had never looked more real to me, more human, more beautiful. I reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her face, my fingers moving instinctively, not out of obligation or habit, but from something much deeper. She closed her eyes for a moment beneath my touch, and I felt something in my chest tighten in response. There was tenderness now, not just heat, not just want, something slower, heavier, more dangerous in its own way. We lay like that for what felt like hours, neither of us moving, barely breathing, just watching each other in the snow-muted light. Eventually, the cold became too much to ignore. I pulled the blanket tighter around us, and she shifted to press even closer. Our bodies molded together easily, like pieces that had been carved to fit. Her hand traced lazy lines along my spine, and I felt goosebumps rise in its wake. Not from the chill, but from the intimacy of it. There was no urgency in her touch this time, no hunger, just connection, as if we were reminding ourselves, and each other, that what had happened wasn't a mistake, that it didn't disappear with the night. Later, we got up together, slowly, moving through the space like it was sacred ground. The cold made everything sharper. The wooden floor bit at our bare feet. Our breath puffed in small clouds in the air, and even the act of pulling on sweaters and socks felt like a ritual. She moved through the room with quiet grace, her eyes flicking to the window every few minutes, her jaw tight, thoughtful. I knew what she was thinking. The snow meant we weren't going anywhere. Not today, maybe not even tomorrow. We were trapped, but neither of us seemed eager to break the spell. We made tea from melted snow, using the dented old kettle we found near the stove. We sat wrapped in blankets, pressed shoulder to shoulder on the floor near the cold hearth, watching steam curl up from chipped mugs. Her thigh brushed mine with every shift of weight, and every time I felt it like a brand. The silence remained, but it wasn't empty. It was full of everything we weren't ready to say, everything we had already said with our bodies, everything we would say again without words. The day passed slowly. The snow outside didn't let up. It continued to fall in a steady, soft curtain, erasing every trail, every footprint, every path that might have led us out. The world outside ceased to exist. No phone calls, no responsibilities, no expectations. Just the two of us and the echo of last night still humming between us. It should have felt claustrophobic. Instead, it felt like freedom. She found a stack of old magazines tucked in a drawer, and we spent an hour thumbing through them, laughing at the outdated fashion, pointing out absurd headlines, sharing the occasional glance that lingered too long. Every moment felt loaded and yet impossibly natural. She rested her head on my lap at one point, her legs stretched out before the fire we had finally rebuilt. I ran my fingers through her hair, slowly, rhythmically, and felt a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. As night fell again, the temperature dropped even lower. We piled every blanket we could find onto the bed, layering ourselves beneath them like children hiding from the dark. This time, there was no hesitation when we touched. Our bodies moved together, without rush, without pressure, just need. The kind of quiet, desperate need that comes not from lust, but from something gentler and infinitely more consuming. We made love differently than the night before. Slower, quieter. There was no frantic undressing, no sharp moans against skin. Only whispers of breath, the creak of the bed frame, the rustle of fabric sliding away. Her hands moved over me like she was memorizing, not conquering. I took my time exploring her again, tracing familiar lines with new reverence, kissing the hollow of her throat until I felt her tremble beneath me. When she came, it was silent, her mouth open, her eyes locked on mine. I held her through it, arms wrapped tightly around her back, her body pressed flush against mine as she melted into the aftermath. We stayed that way for a long time, tangled and flushed, limbs aching but unwilling to part. Her head rested on my chest, and I stroked her back with slow, idle fingers, marveling at how right it felt to hold her, to be held. Outside, the snow kept falling. The cabin creaked and settled with the weight of it, but inside we were warm. Not just from the blankets or the fire or the friction of skin, but from something deeper, something I wasn't ready to name, but was no longer afraid of feeling. That night, I didn't dream. I didn't need to. Everything I had ever longed for was already wrapped in my arms, breathing softly against my neck, buried beneath a mountain of snow, in a place where nothing else existed but us. When the snow began to melt, it didn't feel like relief. It felt like erosion, like the slow undoing of everything we had built inside those walls. The edges of the world returned gradually. First, the distant sounds of dripping water, then the shift of light through the thinning frost on the windows, and finally the mud itself, thick, wet, clinging to the ground like a warning. The trees, once quiet and frozen, began to creak and stir again. Birds returned to the silence, their sharp cries cutting through the stillness like reminders that time was still moving. The outside world, so distant for days, was finding its way back to us. She didn't say much that morning, and I didn't ask questions. We moved around each other differently now, careful, slower. There was an unspoken awareness between us, a mutual understanding that something had shifted. Maybe it was the light, clearer and less forgiving now. Maybe it was the weight of knowing that soon the spell would break. We both sensed it. The moment outside would demand our return, but neither of us wanted to be the first to name it. Packing was a quiet ritual. Our clothes still smelled faintly of smoke and skin and melted snow. I folded mine neatly, maybe too neatly, delaying each task as if precision might stop time. Her movements were more efficient, but there was tension in her shoulders, something I hadn't seen there before. Her hands moved with purpose, but not peace. I watched her from the corner of the room, my chest tightening with something too complex to name. When we opened the door, the wind hit us like a stranger. It smelled of wet bark and rot and the slow thaw of soil beneath snow. The once solid path was now a churned mess of slush and mud, slick and unstable, the kind of ground that swallows your feet and leaves a mark behind. Every step we took felt heavier than the last. My boots sank deep into the earth, the cold moisture seeping through the cracks, pulling at me with every movement. It felt like resistance. It felt like the forest itself wanted to keep us there. We didn't talk on the hike down. The trail was barely recognizable. Fallen branches blocked sections of the path, and the melted snow revealed a mess of dead leaves, soggy moss, and slick patches of dark brown sludge. I walked behind her, watching her navigate the terrain with that same quiet confidence, but now I saw something else in her stride. Urgency. Not panic, not fear, just a need to keep moving, to reach something beyond this place. I tried to match her pace, but my legs felt slower, my steps less certain. My thoughts tangled with each squelching footstep. The sound of mud beneath us became rhythmic, like a pulse, steady and crude. It reminded me of breath, of bodies, of the weight of her on top of me, the heat of her mouth. The way her name had once filled my throat like a prayer. I wanted to grab her wrist, pull her back, bury us both in that cabin again, and pretend the world had never started thawing. But I didn't. I followed instead. I let her lead, just like I always had. When we reached the road, the sight of pavement made my stomach twist. Her car was still there, half covered in a slush-drenched blanket of pine needles and dirt. It looked strange now, out of place, like a relic from another life. She brushed the windshield off with her sleeve, cleared the snow without ceremony, and unlocked the doors with a mechanical beep that broke the silence like a slap. I hesitated before getting in. The air inside was stale and cold. The seats felt unfamiliar. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel with practiced ease, and I realized how much I had forgotten about this version of her, the one that lived outside the woods, outside our bed, outside me. The road was slippery, the tires spinning slightly as we started to move. I watched the trees blur past the window, mud streaking across the windshield every time the tires dipped too deep into the slush. The wipers clicked in a steady rhythm, a sound that felt oddly violent. I kept waiting for her to say something, to reach over and place a hand on my knee like she had done nights ago, to smile the way she had in the firelight. But she stared straight ahead, jaw set, eyes narrowed against the glare of the wet road. We didn't go back to my place. We didn't go to hers. We went to a motel off the highway, one of those cheap roadside ones with faded blue trim and numbers on the doors that had started to peel. She parked without asking. I followed without resisting. The man at the front desk gave us a look that tried to be neutral and failed. I didn't care. Neither did she. The room smelled like disinfectant and loneliness. The bedspread was ugly, too bright against the dimness of the lamp. She closed the door behind us and locked it. Then she pulled me into her without hesitation. It wasn't tender this time. It wasn't slow. She kissed me like she was trying to erase something. Her hands were rougher, faster, her movements urgent. Clothes hit the floor without care. We didn't bother with the lights. The curtains were drawn tight. Her mouth found my skin like it was searching for proof, for confirmation that this wasn't just a dream. I gave in to her completely, my body reacting before my thoughts could catch up. We collapsed onto the bed, a tangle of limbs and breath and memory. Her fingers left bruises this time. Her nails scraped down my back. My thighs clenched around her waist like I was trying to trap her inside me, as if holding her tighter could stop what I knew was coming. Afterward, we lay side by side, bodies sticky with sweat and silence. The room hummed with the low whine of a heater. I stared at the water stains on the ceiling, the crooked picture on the wall, the worn edge of the nightstand. She lit a cigarette with shaking fingers, even though she told me she quit. She didn't offer me one. I didn't ask. I realized then what this was. Not love, not safety, not a future. It was residue. It was heat left behind in the ashes. It was mud on the soles of boots that would be cleaned and forgotten. She turned to look at me, eyes soft now, almost sorry. I looked away. I didn't want her apology. I didn't want to be forgiven. I wanted to stay in the dirt of it, to remember what it felt like to be undone. We dressed in silence. She kissed my shoulder once, just once, and then walked out before I could respond. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after, the imprint of her body still warm in the mattress, the scent of her still clinging to the sheets, and the taste of her still thick on my tongue. The snow was gone. The fog had lifted. The fire had burned out. And all that remained was mud. I don't remember what pulled me back to the cabin. Maybe it was the silence I couldn't find anywhere else. Or maybe it was the ghost of something I hadn't been able to bury. Weeks had passed since that drive down the mountain, since the motel room that reeked of finality and sweat and smoke, since her body pressed into mine like an apology I never asked for. Life had returned in that numbing, endless way life tends to. Emails, groceries, eyeliner. I moved through it like someone wearing a version of herself that no longer fit, seams splitting quietly at the joints. The roads were clearer now, the snow long gone, replaced by soft mud that had since dried and cracked in the sun. The forest had changed again. What was once white and blurred had become sharp and green, life crawling up bark and between stones. But the trails still remembered us. My boots knew the path. My body followed muscle memory. I didn't need a compass. I didn't want one. I was looking for something I couldn't explain, something I didn't expect to find, but needed to face anyway. The cabin stood exactly where we'd left it, though the wood looked older, darker, like it had absorbed everything we did inside it and decided to rot from the inside out. I opened the door, and the creak sounded like a voice I hadn't heard in too long. Dust floated in slants of light that pierced the cracks in the walls. The air inside was stale and still, as though time had held its breath in my absence. I walked slowly, deliberately, stepping back into the imprint of who I had been in that space. I touched the table where we once laid our clothes. I ran my fingers over the frame of the bed where she made me tremble and beg and forget who I thought I was. I sat where we had watched the fire die. I stared at the floor where our bodies had tangled like roots. Everything was quieter now, even the memories. I slept on the floor that night, wrapped in a blanket that still smelled faintly of wood smoke and mildew. The cold crept into my bones, and I welcomed it. I needed to feel something that wasn't want or shame or confusion. I needed the ache of my body to match the one that had settled in my chest and refused to leave. I dreamt of her, but not in the way I expected. She wasn't touching me. She wasn't kissing me. She was standing in the doorway, half in shadow, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. I reached for her, but she didn't move. She just stood there. And when I blinked, she was gone. In the morning, I opened the drawer by the bed, not expecting anything more than dust and maybe a forgotten mouse nest. What I found instead made my breath catch. A folded piece of paper tucked beneath a rotted handkerchief. My name was written on the outside in handwriting I recognized instantly, sharp, slanted, impatient. I unfolded it with trembling hands, my heart thudding in my ears so loud I could barely hear the world around me. It wasn't long, just a few lines. She had come back too, sometime after me. She had sat in the same spot, stared at the same wood, and realized she couldn't stay. She had met someone else, or maybe she always had someone else. The words were vague, intentionally blurred. She said I had changed something in her, that what we had was real, but temporary, a necessary destruction. She used the word catalyst. She said she hoped I understood. And then, at the bottom, she wrote something that turned my stomach inside out. I'm keeping a part of you. The best part. Thank you for giving it to me. My hands went cold. My mouth dried. I read it again and again. Each time it felt more brutal, more personal. I didn't know what she meant at first, but then I remembered the final time I saw her, the way she had kissed me slowly before pulling away, the way she looked at me like she was sealing something permanent, like she was stealing something without asking. I stood in the doorway of the cabin for a long time after that, her letter in my hand, the air thick with spring and decay. I thought about the phrase over and over. Keeping a part of you, the best part. It wasn't just poetry. It was possession. It was intention. I had given her access to everything, my body, my trust, my silence. And she had taken it with both hands, smiling. And now, all that remained of me was bone. Not literally, but it felt that way, as if the layers had been stripped off, skin peeled away, muscle pulled back. What remained was structure, bare, honest, ugly in its simplicity, the raw outline of who I was without her, without the hunger, without the illusion. I didn't cry. There was nothing left to shed. I walked to the fire pit, dropped the letter in, and watched it burn without ceremony. The flames ate her words like they were hungry too. The paper curled, blackened, then vanished. I left the cabin without looking back. I didn't want it to be a monument. I didn't want it to be a place of worship or grief. I wanted it to disappear, the same way she had. Quietly, without explanation, without apology. The trail was drier on the way down, but there were still places where the ground gave way, patches of mud that sucked at my boots, demanding something in return. I didn't resist. I let the forest take what it wanted. I had already given up the rest. By the time I reached the road, my legs were sore, my arms scratched, my face flushed with wind and memory. The car door creaked when I opened it, the sound familiar now, grounding. I sat behind the wheel for a long time before starting the engine. My hands were steady. My jaw was tight. I felt emptied. Not broken, just emptied. Somewhere inside me, she still lived. In the way I noticed silence, in the way my body responded to warmth, in the way I sometimes craved ruin without understanding why. She had carved herself into me, a permanent wound that looked like a gift, and I had let her. But now all that remained was bone. And bone, as fragile as it may seem, doesn't bleed. Bone remembers. Bone endures.